We're talking about cruise ships and the COVID-19 problem. And I am delighted to offer such a fantastic lineup of presenters who will give a variety of different technical and human perspectives of how COVID is affecting the seagoing leisure industry. An industry that was growing globally at a phenomenal rate over the last 10 years. European and American cruise ship holidays were increasing steadily, but it was the spectacular growth being witnessed in Asia Pacific that was driving the delivery of dozens of new high-tech cruise ships each year. However, the industry stopped over a matter of 6 weeks back in March and February, March. Although there have been attempts to restart sea and river cruises, these have faltered due to infections and the ever-changing national social distancing restrictions. So tonight we have 4 speakers, led first by Robert McMahon, who will give the main substantive presentation that outlines the issues in the cruise ship industry. Robert's been a member of the IMarEST for 55 years, and for the last 48, he's been a fellow of the Institute. His career progressed from a seagoing chief engineer to superintendent engineer, ship fleet manager, fishing fleet superintendent, charter vessel owner, and now an energy efficiency specialist, in parallel with 42 years in the Royal Australian Naval Reserve to the rank of Lieutenant Commander. Robert, we hope, will be followed by Bernie Farrelly. Bernie's been working for the TASBUL Seafarers Foundation to project manage an initiative to provide and improve well-being and assistance to foreign seafarers who've been berthed at Australian ports by focusing on the provision of Wi-Fi for seafarers when they are in port. He began with a focus on ports in the state of New South Wales. Previously, he was employed as a national lead organiser with the Maritime Union of Australia. Mr. Michael Kelly is our third speaker, and Michael is a pilot for the Port Authority of New South Wales. Michael commenced his seagoing career as an integrated rating in 1991, sailing with a variety of Australian companies before gaining his tickets at the Sydney Institute of Technology. He then decided to see the world by sailing with P&O Containers, TK Tankers, Clyde Marine, and also with the Royal Caribbean cruise ships. On gaining his Masters Class 1, he joined AdSteam as a tugmaster before moving to the Maritime Safety Queensland as a pilot in the Port of Mackay. He spent the last 12 years as a pilot in his hometown of Sydney. And finally, Sister Mary Leahy, Regional Coordinator, Apostleship of the Sea. Sister Mary came to Australia from Ireland following her sister Geraldine, also a nun, in 1979, and initially trained to be a nurse. After her profession as a sister of St. Joseph, she worked at St. Vincent's Hospital until her appointment as the port chaplain in 1992. Today, she's the regional coordinator for Oceania for the Apostles of the Sea. So I am really looking forward to the presentations and the discussion at the end. You can join in with the discussions by posting questions in the Slido tool that accompany the link that you enter the webinar. So first of all, I'd like to now hand you over to our first speaker, Robert McMahon. Robert.
Yes, good morning. And I'd like to thank Kevin Duffy for offering to host this meeting. It's a pleasure to have him on board. We're moving on to the first slide on my program. Cruise ships and COVID-19 problem. It has been a big problem. And we look at the technologies that are emerging to help manage and prevent infections on ships. The goals here are to identify, protect, detect, respond, and return to normal. Next slide, we can see a picture of the Ruby Princess. Here, 900 COVID infections are reported by government authorities, 28 deaths. It's a real tragedy. And we can see that the modern cruise ships, we have large numbers of people in close confined spaces, and this is the problem. The COVID risks of transmission are person to person, and touch points. So the goal is to develop interventions, prevent the COVID coming onto the ships, detect it if it's on board and before it gets on board. If it breaks out, treatment is important, that people, passengers, crew, anybody on the ship is treated to the best possible standard and removed ashore as soon as possible to shoreside facilities. And then we have infection control and recovery. The ships need thorough cleaning and recovery, and the people also to recover. Move on, next slide. Here's another example. The expedition ship Greg Mortimer. It left for a cruise to the Antarctic from Argentina with 217 people on board, testing COVID negative. But 14 days later, 60% of the passengers and crew are infected. Now, there was a doctor on board, a professor of respirology specialist, respiratory specialist, Dr. Alvaning, and he made a log of everything, which has been very helpful. And he's pointed to the identification of asymptomatic people. That's people who have got the infection, but it doesn't show in the tests. Next slide. We can see an example of a fishing vessel. Here, same again in Argentina, the crew, 60 crew, went in quarantine for 14 days, and they all tested negative. They flew down to join the ship, left port on a 35-day fishing voyage. And here on the right, we can see the fish they're catching, these prized Patagonian toothfish, which is an endangered species in some parts of the great southern continent. And 35 days later, they all negative, all positive when they arrived back in Ushuaia. So the Argentine authorities had a major investigation, and what they found was some of the crew were close to an infected person on the flight down from Buenos Aires, and that's what the authorities found. So it's just so important to test for the asymptomatic condition where it doesn't show. If a test is 99.9% effective, that 1 in 1,000 might be the one that gets through and starts an infection on a ship. So there was no self-criticism from the ship or the authorities. It was, and there we go to the next slide where I'll explain. In the Journal of Hospital Infection, we can see an infected person here, droplets and airborne bacteria, and you can see it can touch the bed in the hospital and a person, and infection can occur. In air, the pathogen survival rate is 3 hours, copper 4 hours, cardboard 24 hours, stain and plastic up to 72 hours, and sometimes longer on stainless steel. And we'll move on to the next slide, and we can see here how we can ventilate a room or a cabin. And there we have an infected person, and we can see the droplets coming out. And with the pressure low or negative pressure, air can flow in through an open door or window. That's why it's important for the quarantine cabins to be on the outside if possible, so they can get closer to fresh air. And air can go out through the doors, windows, ventilators, and air conditioning where it can be cleaned by UV light. And here we have another UV lamp in the cabin and a portable UV air cleaner. So the UV lamps can kill the virus. let the sunshine in. The virus doesn't last long in the sunshine. And there we have the investigators of the Diamond Princess in Japan found that people in outside cabins, they had no infections. Passengers in quarantine in the inside cabins, a number became infected, which reinforces the point that I've just made. And in the next slide, we look at the symptoms. There's body temperature, sore throat, coughing, flu. The tests, breathalyzer, antibody, blood and body, and waste clinical tests. The waste is an important one for ships because it tests the wastewater, and that can identify infections on board. Shipboard detection devices, temperature screening systems, manual temperature screening, walk-through detection portals, and the small wearable mask, which I'll illustrate a little later, and track the virus. Then you can automate with sensors, pathogen sensor alerts, and also the wearable device can be alerted in the doctor surgery or elsewhere on the ship. UV light can also cause fluorescence, which can help identify bacteria and for further tests, epidemiological tests. So the cruise ships now need a medical team on board and maybe a mobile testing lab. They need to be effective, approved by health authorities and specialists. And remote monitoring of data is important and is sensible for ships. Personal data can be destroyed after a limited time if people are concerned about people storing their data. But for the tracking and tracing of the infection, it's a very important method to use. In the next slide, we're getting down to the emerging testing devices. We've got an antibody testing. We've got a pathogen detector put out by Path Sensors. It checks the virus through the signature of the technology of measuring the signature of the virus. It can tell what it is against another sample of the virus in the equipment. Handheld metabolic analyzer is shown here. That's developed from the auto mass screening equipment by Ohio State University. And there's next to zero side effects because there's no substances ingested. There's other detectors being developed around the place. The University of Maryland found there's no false positives or negatives with this detector, which is a very good, and then a classic breathalyzer designed to detect traces in seconds in France. So we can move on. The next slide. Here we can see airports, mass thermal cameras for detecting viruses in people. Here we've got short wavelength UV light. Now the short wavelength, 222 nanometers and below, is safe. Normal UV is unsafe because it can cause skin damage and eye damage to people, but very good at killing the passengers. But the low wavelength is safe for humans, and it can be used in public places and in ships and in cabins. And manufacturers in Japan are developing lights now with the universities in the US, and we'll soon see lights available in the far range, and there's a lot of potential there to manage and kill the pathogen without harm to people. Next slide, please. Here's fast temperature screening in an airport or ship terminal situation or railway station. Here we see these screens, and if people that don't pass get a second check. We move on to the next slide, please. Here we've got rapid antibody tests. There's They've now been approved in US, North America, Australia, EU, and other countries. And it can help to quickly identify symptomatic and asymptomatic people. But having said that, it's not 100%. It might be 99.7 or 99.9. So we still need the detection on board the ships. Even if everybody's negative going on, there might be 1 or 2 it gets through without being detected. Next slide. Here we've got an example of a portal where you can combine all the people can walk through. They can turn around in UV light to disinfect their clothes. They can have a temperature check. They can be checked for metal detection and count people counting. So that's potential development that could be used on cruise ships, people boarding cruise ships, in port, people when they come ashore, when they come back on board, or when they first join, or when they leave the ship, they can walk through this and be checked, which is a good development to move forward with. Next slide, please. Here we can see the devices. Here, this device here is a Bluetooth device which can be worn around the neck to detect infected persons nearby. Now, the accuracy is not 100%, but it can check people with fever nearby, and that's very useful. Obviously, you'd want to stay away from it, and the people concerned need to be alerted also, so they can be checked and tested. Here, this device here, worn in the neck area where the near the bronchial tract, near the throat. It shows the vital signs, and it can be transmitted to your ship's doctor or to your physician, and it's very accurate for the early detection. And we would recommend this device to be worn in where there's high risk, particularly crew members that might be moving around a ship and seeing a lot of people. Here we've got a Relay Go, a wearable walkie-talkie for internal communication. Next slide, please. Here, cruises have started. Now, this particular cruise is Genting cruises, cruises in the Taiwan waters for Taiwan residents, but it's been certified by DNV-GL. So the stringent health screening processes, mandatory declarations, enhanced infection control on board and in the terminals, hospital standard procedures for vessel procedures, and 100% fresh air if people become infected and quarantined, not to take the chance of mixing the infected air with the other air in the vessel. No buffets, food served by staff wearing face masks. And DNV, as well as training, they also assess the company for their management systems and their scope to deal with infectious disease management. Now, all of the classification societies, Lloyd's, RINA in Italy, the US, they're all looking at similar ways of checking for COVID, but the DNV is the first one that's come up with a very strong system, and it's been adopted by Florida. To the best of my knowledge, they've had no infections since they've been running now for about 3 or 4 months. Next slide, please. Here's the Finnmarken. Hurtigruten cruises started 4 ships in the Norwegian fjords. They worked with the Norwegian Institute guidelines and self declaration and face masks, similar processes, and they're running very well for about 3 or 4 months, and then disaster hit. One of their ships became infected, and what they found was infected crew were allowed to be brought on board. And so on one of the ships, the manager of this line, the CEO, was livid that such a thing could happen, and on his company, where he went to great lengths to make sure everything was going to be fine. But it comes down to the training and the culture on the ship. So we do need to upgrade the systems, upgrade the training, so it doesn't happen again. So what he's done is closed down all the cruises until further notice. He's put the police investigating, DNV investigating. So he's taken it very seriously. And we hope that all the shipping companies take this seriously, because the experts and common sense will tell you if you can keep the pathogen off the ship, then they're completely safe as far as catching the COVID is concerned. Next slide. Here's another one with more details, some of the cleaning methods they're using. And in case of infection, they have a system there and a tracking system, and a dedicated health officer on board responsible for ensuring the quality of infection control. That's beside the doctor. Next slide. Here, these pictures are sent by the crew through a portal, and it shows on a cruise ship, there's 4 people to a cabin. It's a confined area. Top tiers are close to ventilation. Here we've got a bathroom, very small. So it's a very high risk area. If one crew becomes infected or even is asymptomatic, infection can easily spread to the others. So what we're saying is that we should target having 1 crew per cabin and identifying asymptomatic people, crew or other people on the ship. I've suggested to use far UV lamps in the bathroom, disinfect regularly, and also to eat foods rich in vitamin D, which is good for helping to fight the virus, and let the sunlight in, because the virus doesn't last long in the sunlight. Next slide. Here, we're talking about the DNV program. They've built it on the hospital system, which has been very successful in USA. Hospitals that have been certified by DNV have got a very high standard, and DNV have adapted that to the maritime environment. So they offer a certification, CIP-M, M for maritime certification. So it's for control and infection. And they've consulted all the leading organizations in the world, WHO, the US authorities, health administration. They've insisted on the quality standards of the management, and national and consulted national and local guidelines where applicable. And of course, each ship has to be individually customized, if the ships are different. But DNV do that, and they'll customize the certification requirements for each ship. And I can strongly recommend their services. And all the classification societies, I'm not picking them out in particular, but I do pick them out because they've advanced more quickly than most others at this stage. We can move on. The next slide, please. And here, management need to get down and have a serious look at how to mitigate the threats and manage the disasters and put the programs in place. Here we can see ship sinks or ships on fire and breakdown at sea. They're considered major ship disasters, but now we believe that a major health outbreak on board needs to be added to that list. And we need plans and systems to cope with it and deal with it if it happens. Here, this diagram is an example. It's an aircraft diagram, but diagrams need to be developed for the ships and the particular ships that we're looking at. So the aircraft threat diagram can be used for training purposes, and it's a good example of how to look at the threats. Next slide. Here, the company training. Here's a bow tie diagram where they look at situations and examine them and bring them all together in a bow tie type diagram. This is a training method used by DNV and used by many companies. So the DNV training incorporates this method. Next slide, please. Here's crew training. Here we're on the spot. This is on land, but imagine the same could be on board ship, or it can be on land. And here the operating crew are trained in the systems that have been determined for their ships, and here they are. So behavior needs to change. You know, sometimes that takes time to build new awareness and change the culture to include the training for prevention of COVID and other diseases. Next slide, please. Here is a new seafarer coming on board. So he hasn't been on board this ship, so he's going to be trained when he first comes on. He has to be qualified for the job he's doing, whether he's in the domestic waters or internationally. And he's done that. Now he's familiarizing with the ship. Next slide. Antiviral nano coatings are emerging, and they're very effective. Here we can see examples, tables, small boats. They can repel the hazard suits, and they can repel the bacteria, and so that it can be managed better. Nanosurface, it stops the bacteria laying on the surface if it's repelled, obviously, especially high traffic areas. Next slide. Here we can see more antiviral technology. It's used in hospital situations. It's used on stainless steel and other places. It's antifungal nano coatings, sprayed or dipping on surfaces such as glass, metals, alloys, copper and stainless. And this is some of the technology, nanoparticles. They're a nanometer is 1/1000th of a meter, so they're very, very fine indeed. And so is the virus, equally small in size. So you've got organic and inorganic nanomaterials, the plant-based materials, and there's man-made materials which can last a little longer at high temperature. Next slide. Antiviral copper. Copper's also used in many places. Here we can see it on railings and door handles. And the copper alloys also are useful. Brasses and bronzes, copper nickel. And it can be applied by spraying processes. And I won't go into the technology right now, but we move to the next slide. Here we can see more examples of copper via vapor deposition process. We've got it on doorways. Here it is in a hospital operating theatre where it's on people's gowns, equipment, and there's a copper-coated mask. So medical devices, bath and door and kitchen hardware, lots of places, PVD. Next slide. Now, when we come to clearing areas of the virus, this is a air canister controller where it sucks air through. It's claimed to kill 99.98% of airborne virus. And there it is in a waiting room area, but it can be used also in a cruise ship area. Next slide. Here's an example of UV lamps, which can be run by programmed from a laptop controller, easy to use controller. It's a robot design. It can be moved around cabin spaces. It can be operated remotely with UV light or with far UV light also. There it is as an example of disinfection as an emerging tool for disinfection. Next slide. Here's fogging, antiviral fogging. Here they use a fog or mist. They use the cathodic method to opposing particles to make the fog, and it penetrates all the areas, hard to get areas. Next slide. And for deliveries to and from ships, here we are at Singapore. The drone is delivering supplies to the ships that can be used for samples, getting small equipment on and to and from vessels. And it can also be used with sensors for tracking large areas. Next slide. Now, this is the chronology of events on the Greg Mortimer, the ship we saw going to Antarctica. It showed the doctors checked the progression of the disease until the ship arrived 14 days later in Montevideo. And Professor Ng's findings were to focus on the asymptomatic people, because if you can detect everybody who's got it, you can isolate them, track it, and keep it under control. So that is important. And Dr. Ng has pointed to that out of the Greg Mortimer disaster. But unfortunately, one Filipino engine rating died as a result of COVID infection on the ship. Everybody else survived. Next slide. Now, this is important. These are the key takeaway points that I'm making. That the health infection is health outbreak is another major maritime risk to be managed. Use effective strategies to fend it off. Change the culture curve so that staff and management and at all levels, from senior, middle to operational levels, are all aware and what to do and how to control things. So the challenge now is to quickly identify the asymptomatic people. We know how to manage the disease. but still the asymptomatic people get through. That's the challenge now. And what we found, the ships that have failed, most of them have failed by ineffective action at a particular ship at a particular time by particular people. So that's where we need to smarten up, do it better. Next slide. Here's Main Shift 2 off on a North Sea voyage out of Hamburg. They've adopted the German health and safety protocols. Next slide. Here's the biggest ship that we know is cruising now in the Mediterranean, the MSC Grandiosa. They're reporting that there's no COVID cases reported. MSC, the safe health protocols and pre-testing of all passengers and crew is working on the world's 7th largest cruising ship. Here it is, MSC Grandiosa. That's the end of the slide. I'd just like to reiterate, just to mention again, the goals are to identify the threats, protect from them, detect them, respond, and recover. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. Now, I think you might have a short video that we have that is in regarding to the topic that I was going to talk about.
The Tazbull Seafarers Foundation is a non-for-profit organisation set up to explore ways to improve the well-being of seafarers in a modern shipping industry.
So the ship arrives, so I took the Wi-Fi up onto the ship. That did my inspection, then I had a conversation with the chief, explaining that it's his responsibility while he's at Port Botany. They set it up. When they finish, they call the bus driver, comes out and picks it up. All your information.
It's really a good initiative from the Seafarers Connect side, because it will be really helpful for us if a new seafarer is joined and he cannot go ashore, so he doesn't have the SIM card, so he can't call to the family, video call and all. With our ship's net, we can hardly make chatting and all is possible because it's expensive. So with the free Wi-Fi, what we can do is utilize all the time for family chatting or downloading some movies which we can't see. So all this we can do it when we are at port.
The feedback from seafarers, it's a fantastic initiative. For the first time in a long time, they've been able to talk to their families. Got some feedback from a seafarer who spoke to his son, whose birthday was yesterday.
Yeah, I got 3 kids. The elder one is about 16-year-old, 16, 13 and 10. So it's always, yeah, and yesterday was my son's birthday, so it's all the more helpful. I was able to watch him cut the cake.
We also supply it with different adapters, which is really helpful because these are the most common adapters which you can see in most of the ships. And we just got it, the instructions were pretty clear and it's really self-explanatory, and the safety officer as well, he explained it pretty good. So we just opened it up, took the exact adapter what is matching to our vessel, and then we just connected and it's done, it's fixed.
The Tazbull Seafarers Foundation has sponsored the provision of these Wi-Fi devices across all the berths at Port Botany in an effort to get it up and running and have a product now that we can go to the industry and we can ask them to chip in a bit of money and provide this really important initiative to other ports right across the country.
Yeah, so just in summary, the Tazbull Seafarers Foundation adopted the project a number of years ago to firstly find a solution to provide Wi-Fi to seafarers when the ship's berthed alongside in the ports in Australia, and then secondly seek to secure funding. And mind you, this was before COVID. So since then, luckily, we launched the project last year prior to COVID, and it's become particularly urgent, I guess, in terms of a project to provide seafarers communication with home and family in this isolation period that they're going through. We've got 25 devices now operating around Australia, and with the cooperation of the terminal operators, where they have agreed to take them on and off ships as they berth and before they depart. The project has been overwhelmingly supported by all involved, and our next steps are to try to secure funding to broaden this project out, with focusing on Melbourne as our next primary target. Having said that, our word of our project, the provision of free, good quality Wi-Fi to seafarers, particularly once again during the COVID lockdown, has, excuse me for my dog, has gained a lot of interest, and we've got one device about to be in the final stages of rolling out in Tasmania, and we've got 3 now in Western Australia. So we've got 25 devices up and going, and seafarers are, that's their only lifeline, the only option seafarers have on ships. I know this is concentrating on cruise ships, which are certainly in terms of communication the same. They've only got access to satellite, and in most cases they have to pay for it. Satellite internet, as everyone knows, is very low quality and very expensive, and doesn't provide a seafarer with the opportunity to live video contact with home and family. So I guess that's in a nutshell, Kevin.
That's great. Thank you very much, Bernie. Really appreciate your input there and the insights to what the foundation is doing. So we'd like to move on to our next presenter now, which is Michael. So Michael, over to you, please.
Yeah, good morning and good evening, everyone. Thank you, Robert, Kevin and Bernie. As you know, I'm a pilot here in Sydney, and we're the first people to see the crew, the captains, and I guess we're ambassadors for Australia. I'm very lucky. I worked for Royal Caribbean for 3 years, so I still see colleagues from 15 years ago. No, 20 years ago. That's how long ago it was when I worked for Royal Caribbean. So I still have friends that sail into Sydney, or used to. And 2 days ago, I was in Sydney and looking at the passenger terminal. There's no cruise ships, so it's very sad, very sad. I have a slide of the QE2, I believe. There we are. That was a few years ago. So every day until March, we'd have a cruise ship at the overseas passenger terminal. Some days we have 3 and 4 cruise ships. And as I said earlier, it's a very sad sight to see that. But in March this year, we saw a large number of cruise ships call into Sydney, and they disembarked thousands of passengers, and they set sail in uncertain times. And we estimated there were 20,000 seafarers drifting off the coast on cruise ships. That was in March. The captain on the Pacific Explorer, an Italian, he said to me, "Michael, we have plenty of food and are safer here than in Italy." Little did he know that the ship would have to sail to the Philippines and wait out the storm. And I spoke to that captain not long ago, and he'd been on board for 140 days. Normally he'd do a 3-month contract, and tough times for them. With the regular cruise ships that call into Sydney, you build up a friendship with the crew and the captains, and sadly they're forgotten about. And I do keep in contact with a lot of them, a lot are at sea, and they are suffering. They're really, really going through a tough time. Next slide, thanks. Many of us here in Sydney were involved with the Ruby Princess, and that picture there, that's the Ruby Princess sailing without any passengers. And I took that photo because normally there'd be thousands of passengers on their cabins, and it was an eerie feeling, and we didn't know what was going to happen a few weeks later. And a lot of us had to give police statements. There was a commission, big inquiry. but the plight of the seafarers is never mentioned in the report. And a lot of us here in Sydney, we had to lobby the government to get that ship back to Port Kembla because we all knew there were a lot of sick crew members on board, which we all know about. 8 months later, the ships are out at anchor, minimum manning levels, low stores, and low morale. I have colleagues sailing with MSC Princess, Royal Caribbean. They tell me having their wages cut by 70%, the staff being charged for soft drinks and cappuccino, and some companies charging $65 a month to use the internet. Bernie touched on that, the high cost of using the internet. We know there's crew from Kiribati and Tuvalu that are still on board because their countries are shut down. We see them on container ships. And Sister Mary, she'll touch on that a bit later. Next slide, please. That's one of the pilots from a port in Australia. He had to board a cruise ship that had some cases of COVID, and he said it to walk on the bridge of a ship dressed like that. It's not normal. We have to do it. Next slide, please. That's myself on the Celebrity Solstice, and you can see the captain in the background. On that day, we had 5 Royal Caribbean ships come into Sydney, and they transferred. All the Indians went on one ship, Filipinos on another ship. It's a big day, a lot of emotions. The captains didn't know where they were going. The crew, you can just see, you can't smile, you can't see anyone's facial expressions. Everyone keeps their distance. It's not a nice environment, and I miss them. Next slide, please. That was the Pacific Explorer on St. Patrick's Day. That's the St. Patrick's Day it sailed, and they headed off the coast, not knowing where they were going. And I just happened to go past a pub in Sydney, and the publican gave me all these hats. So smiling faces, but a few weeks later, I don't think they'd be smiling. So they were the good times. Next photo, please. That's the Ovation of the Seas. That's our biggest cruise ship we get. I'll touch on, Bernie touched on technology, but what are the first things we see? As a pilot, we're the first to engage with the ship's crew, and we were once greeted with smiles, but wearing masks removes that personal touch, which I miss. We all have to wear PPE gear, masks, gloves, sometimes disposable overalls, and it makes for a unique pilotage. When I get to the bridge, I'll always ask the captain how they are, and I always ask who's been on the longest. And as of last week, we're seeing ships' crews 15 months on board. They haven't been ashore since February, March. The captains just want to talk. It's very hard to do the pilotage. As you know, in the airline industry, when they're under maybe 5,000 feet, you don't talk about where you're going for dinner or how your children are. And the captains just want to talk because they haven't been off the ship for 8 months. They want to know why our government won't allow them ashore. They just want to talk. So it is difficult to listen and to concentrate. But luckily, I've been doing it for 15 years, and maybe it's like riding a bike. You can do your job and listen. Captains in Maersk, they feel that the companies are so big that it's a logistic nightmare to get them home. They're angry at our government, and they just feel forgotten, which is true. What we're seeing, and I'm seeing it from firsthand, is I'll give the helmsman a course to steer. They'll stay steer 312, and the helmsman will say 123, and you look and I'll say, how long have you been on board? And they'll say 14 months, sir. And you can just see how tired they are. They're just not there. They can go to port instead of starboard. Engineers can shut the wrong valve in the engine room. The crew can stand in the wrong place with the mooring lines. I often tell the linesman on the radio, just be kind. Don't yell at the crew. They're tired. They've been here a long time. We're going to do things slowly. We're just going to do one line at a time. And they don't understand because they haven't been to sea. So a lot of captains are worried there is an accident just around the corner. We've heard of cooks burning themselves. Simple. After 14 months, cooking 7 days a week for 14 months, little accidents are happening. When we tie up, and I don't have another ship to go to, I'll just hang around, ask them what they need, just talk. They just want to talk. I actually take a pack of UNO cards I have in my bag, and we've had a few delays on departure, and I'll get the UNO cards out and explain how the game goes, and you can see a weight comes off their shoulders, and I leave the cards. I say, here you go. This is a gift. This is a gift. When I go ashore at the gangway, I always watch the stevedore, the customs, port state march up the gangway and start barking orders at this poor officer of the watch that's been on board for a long time. No one ashore understands how they feel, what's going on. On a positive side, here in Sydney, we have the Wi-Fi, Bernie explained, and all the pilots here make sure it goes on board, and we explain how to use it, and they love it. They actually, it's the best thing for them. Since COVID's begun, Sister Mary will touch on it, but we've raised quite a fair bit of money, and we take care packages on board, deodorant, toothpaste, chocolates. Today I got an email from a captain. He's got holes in his socks. Yeah, would be able to buy him some socks. I've spoken on our national radio ABC program, and we have a lot of ladies that knit beanies for the seafarers. So I think we're probably 700 beanies have been knitted and gone out to seafarers around Australia. Robert McMahon, that spoke really well, did a lot of research. Robert, he's researched on board games, what board games seafarers will bring them together. So we've bought a lot of board games for the seafarers to take on board. And one captain said to me a few weeks ago, and next slide, thanks, Jess. One captain said, he said, Michael, it's amazing. Most ports in the world take our cigarettes in stores, but you give us stores. You give us stuff. We love coming to Port Botany. And Sister Mary, who's going to speak next, we're so blessed to have Sister Mary in Sydney. She does a lot for the seafarers. And that lovely picture there, that's the Ovation of the Seas going past the Opera House. Next photo, thanks. And last, that's myself on a MAREST container ship before COVID. And you can just see their faces. Without the seafarers, we all know the world would stop, but try and explain that to Mr. Public, they wouldn't understand. And I hope this COVID ends soon, because we are seeing a lot of seafarers taken ashore in ambulances, suffering from mental illness. I've had captains break down in tears, just wanting to go home. And I'll get Sister Mary to touch on that. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Michael. Really great insight. So I'll give it over to our final presenter, Sister Mary.
Oh, good evening. Can you hear me?
we can.
Okay. Well, you hardly think you'd need a chaplain with the other speakers here, but anyway, I'm the chaplain here in Sydney, and you know, thank you to the other speakers and everybody here tonight. It's great to put shine a light on the lives of seafarers as well as the technology behind the whole thing. The other day, I had a bit of fun on board the vessel in Sydney. A regular crew, and I often send them things through social media, you know, about webinars and about different things. So we had a bit of a brainstorm about the lingo around COVID and seafarers. And we had a lot of fun with different languages and everything. So some of the lingo is, of course, floating prison, as if it never happened before, you know yourself. And the other thing is crew change. Well, that really has always been a bit of an issue at times, you know, contracts, you know, over contract, under contract, webinars, for God's sake, Zoom meetings and collateral victims. And it was a bit of fun, really, but, you know, they were trying to find their own place in all of that as human beings, you know. And of course, as we know, the great 18th century English writer, Samuel Johnson, he likened life at sea to that of being in a prison with the added bonus of the possibility of drowning. And, you know, that sort of says it all in a way. So the lingo, I suppose, is around, you know, shore leave and everything that we talk about every day. But of course, the reality is, in my opinion, humble, as a chaplain, of course, is that COVID-19 has simply exacerbated an abusive structure that's been in place for a long, long time. The reality, of course, is that suffering is exacerbated, that maybe what looks like modern slavery is exacerbated too. The erosion of human rights exacerbated, abuse and death certainly exacerbated. So God help us, you know, seafarers they've always suffered. This is nothing new. They've always suffered. This is shining a light. And I feel that the shining of the light can be a catalyst for, you know, reforming the whole shipping industry if we only could. I guess, you know, the abuses have always been. And one little example is a seafarer that we had here in Sydney, and I've got her permission to tell a little bit of her story. And we like to get the voice of the seafarer. Danny, a Filipina third officer on a very big coal ship up in Newcastle, had suffered months and months of abuse from her superiors on board. And she simply didn't know where to go with it. She didn't really know much about seafarers clubs, chaplains, Port State Authority, you know, or AMSA here, or ITF. She didn't know a whole lot because she was a young Filipina starting out her third ship as a third mate and doing her best. And she just came up against this horrible, abusive situation. Eventually, she did seek help through the authorities here and came ashore and spent her 14 days in quarantine. And, you know, God love her. I had her details and I used to text her at the quarantine hotel, and she was shy because seafarers don't want to cause trouble and they don't want to ask for things. But gradually I used to take some Chinese food at the hotel and one afternoon she texted me and she said, look, I can't eat because I'm crying too much because this is so kind. Well, you know how kind that was. It took me 5 minutes to do it, but for her, it was kindness. When she got out of quarantine, she spent a week and a half here waiting for a flight. And she was overwhelmed with the care of the people who were on the webinar tonight and many others, minding her, loving her, you know, like just taking care of her. When I was with her the night before her flight, I said to her, do you feel strong enough to fly home? You know, do you really feel strong enough? God help us. None of us would have coped with the abuse she had. And she said, the last week has healed me a little bit. And it was simply the love of people. And this is what seafarers miss out on, often. And I suppose one thing that comes to my mind in this recent situation is that shipping companies tend to employ bosses rather than leaders. And I find now the hierarchical system on cargo ships is mainly my focus. The hierarchical system is breaking down. Masters are there too long, they're tired, and they've maybe forgotten how to be leaders. And it is a very, very, very sad thing, to see that. So when I go on a ship now, one time when I went, I wouldn't bother the captain unless there was time or whatever. Now captains are down in the gangway, desperate to talk to someone. So, I just think that issue of reforming the shipping industry, which is a major issue, I know, would be shipping companies taking responsibility for employing leaders, bosses who are leaders, if they can put it that way, rather than bosses who boss people around. Because you go on a ship and people are, scared and frightened and all the rest of it. And then all of a sudden you've got a captain who's cracking up because he's been there too long and they don't have the skill to deal with it. And I suppose the other thing is it's a global issue in terms of the many, many global companies that use, merchant shipping to get their cargo to and fro, and God knows what else. In terms of the Modern Slavery Act, maybe it's a time we can look at a reform of all of this and, discuss with companies, in terms of ethics. Are they sure that their supply chain is slavery free? And I know this is a huge issue, but I really think this is a catalyst for renewal, I feel. I know that globalization feeds into the greed that we all have for wanting our things now rather than they being late. And it's easy to forget about the human factor, and why are we more important than them? Even in the cruise industry, why as a cruiser am I more important than the crew member who's suffering for my lovely voyage, So I think leadership is a whole issue. I think seafarers, they've been stereotyped, and I feel at the moment they're even further stereotyped in a way, but at least it's shining a light on them and their lives and their families. And maybe that's enough for me, I think. Kevin, thank you.
Thank you, Sister Mary. That was just an amazing insight, really, into what you're seeing and what you're witnessing. We're going to move into questions and answers. We've got sort of 5 or 10 minutes just to have a little bit of a discussion. And Sister Mary, I mean, what you've just articulated there, linking back to the fact that, you're witnessing what's close to being slavery in our industry, and the fact that we rely on ships to transport people all the time. I mean, what are the main problems that you're seeing? What are the real difficulties that you're seeing in people?
I think one thing that I'm picking up is a kind of a fatalistic attitude that seafarers no longer have didn't ever really, but now more so, don't have a capacity to participate in their own life, working life. They kind of put their home life on hold when they're on board, and they live in that dream world of what it was like when they left home, and they try to knuckle down and put up with untold types of verbal abuse on board and other forms of abuse that I would imagine. So there's that kind of desperation, I think, in seafarers, a kind of they're resigned to this dreadful prison, I suppose, Yeah.
So if I can take up with Michael, just linking back to what Sister Mary has just said, you must be seeing the similar effects. I mean, do you think there are going to be long-lasting effects with the people that you're seeing that visit your port?
I think so. Another thing we haven't touched on is their families at home. I've met captains. One of their parents had passed away. They can't get home. Seafarers, their wives are having children. They can't get home. So it's affecting their families as well. And I think a lot of seafarers won't return to sea. As Sister Mary said, young Danny, I met Danny, took her around Sydney. I doubt she'll return to sea. It's long-lasting effects for sure.
Yeah. Just going to Bernie now. You seem to be putting smiles on people's faces, so that must be a really powerful stimulus for you to continue doing the work by helping people in difficulty. How do you get the funding anyway for your initiative?
Well, to get the project off the ground, we funded the provision of 10 devices. I think it cost us around $300,000 at the time, because it was we just embarked on this initiative. So we've worked out how to do it a little bit cheaper, but we funded Port Botany with 10 devices to get it off the ground. The Port Authority of New South Wales have come on board since then, and now we're out to the industry, the industry stakeholders. We haven't got any bites or interest from the shipping companies. However, as we've only started rolling this project out last year and COVID's happened now, we really need to take this to the heads of the shipping companies, which are overseas, to seek some funding. But at the moment, we're approaching industry stakeholders shoreside in Australia, and we've got a lot of interest. But it just takes time to raise the funding. And in terms of I couldn't say joy about seeing the relief and the happiness of seafarers, because it's on the back of misery. But it is satisfaction, and it is warming to see a seafarer so enthused about being able to spend 15 minutes talking to their family uninterrupted with a good signal. Sister Mary and I went on board a ship not so long ago, and the captain sat down with us, and he said, if only the shoreside people understood that what it would mean to the crew to have half an hour to go and have a glass of wine, or walk through a shopping centre, or go for a walk in a park, kick a ball. It doesn't have to be mingling with other people. And by the time, it should be added that by the time these ships get down to the southern part of the east coast of Australia, they've been at sea for more than 15 days. So they're in more isolation than we are. So, it's just those little things that people don't understand make so much of a difference. But it certainly has driven us. We were driven at the start, but to be able to now go forward and really put all of our resources into trying to get funding to broaden this out nationally.
Thank you, Bernie. Robert, turning to you now, we've had a couple of questions that have come in which are really related, and it's, do we think that we can get tourism to go back into cruising in the volume and the nature that was happening before COVID, or is the industry just going to be too damaged? And when we put all those measures together that you outlined, are people really wanting to be going on a cruise ship holiday? What's your view, Robert?
Yeah, a lot of people I talk to want to go cruising again when it's safe. They want assurance. If it's safe, they'll go back cruising. And it's like all disasters. We get over it in time, and I think cruising will return. But there'll be a period of transition where a lot of people just don't want to do it. But once they know it's safe again, I think people will go back to cruising.
Yeah, let's hope so. I mean, the industry is enormous. It employs a lot of people and provides a lot of pleasure for people. And so I think that, you know, let's just hope that it does. We've almost run out of time, and I just think that I don't know how to really wrap this up, because it's been such a fascinating and insightful evening with such great points of views. I think let's just start off by saying thank you very much to Robert, Bernie and your dog, Michael and Mary, for giving up your valuable personal time and sharing your considerable knowledge and insights into this fascinating and very relevant topic.